Hi, and welcome to the fourth in the series of podcasts on realistic business forecasting. Today, I want to talk about relationships. Relationships are particularly important because they are the main reason why so many forecasts are poor quality. So let's get cracking. Now, what I'm going to be looking at specifically today is a relationship of the variable we're interested in with others. The relationship with time is relatively complex, and I'm going to leave that for another occasion. Now, what I've got here is an example. And let's say I want to look at the demand for mobile telephones. And that's my dependent variable. Now, what factors are likely to influence the demand for mobile telephony? And I've listed four here. I've got GDP per capita, which is economic growth effectively, the price of mobile telephony, so how much like a subscription package costs or cost per call, the quality of the mobile network itself, how efficient is the network, how easy is it to make connections, what's the quality of the calls like, and coverage. And finally, the cost of the handsets themselves. Now, for each of these four, I've actually got a hypothesis, which is something I've mentioned in the past. How are these variables likely to affect my dependent variable? So for GDP per capita, as people get wealthier, then the take-up of mobile phones is likely to be higher. And you actually see this in data around the world. So places like Europe generally have more than one handset per person. In less developed parts of Africa, the figure might be, say, well below 50%. So one handset for two or more people. If the price of mobile telephony increases, then that will probably reduce demand. That's standard economics. As the quality of the network increases, then that should improve demand for mobile telephones. And what I mean by quality here, normally quality is difficult to quantify. So what I've suggested here is, if you have a higher proportion of the population living in urban areas where coverage is normally better than rural areas, then that should increase demand. So the more urbanized the population is, the higher the demand should be for mobile phones. And finally, the cost of handsets. As the cost of handsets drops, we would expect the demand for mobile phones to increase. So those are my four directions, as I've called them, and I think they're relatively uncontroversial. I hope they are. Now, before I get going into the detail, I want to issue the warning. One of the clients I dealt with, to actually assess relationships, used two functions in Excel called intercept and slope. These are horrible, to be quite honest. They fulfill the same function as just assessing a linear trend line on a graph. So as well as assuming that a relationship is a straight line, which isn't necessarily the case, as I'll demonstrate quite shortly, what's also important, having established a relationship, is the quality of that relationship. And intercept and slope provide no information on that whatsoever. A much more powerful tool is, again in Excel, data analysis, regression. And this is something which will be covered at great length in the future podcast. But for now, the key takeaway is, do not be tempted to use intercept and slope, ever. Okay, that's enough of the finger wagging. Let's go on to something else. So what shape is this line? Well, you might be inclined to say, based on what you can see here, that it's linear, which is a fair assumption. Now, this analyst has collected data between the values of 10 and 30, as you can see from the chart. But what's the true underlying pattern of this relationship? It is, in fact, an S-curve. And actually, fixed this S-curve, so the minimum value it could attain was 5% and the maximum was 90%. Now, this might look like something pretty esoteric, but let me assure you, it's not. And the S-curve is a very common relationship. Now, what's the consequences of getting the relationship wrong? Well, what I've done here is I've imposed a straight line onto the S-curve. We assumed it was a straight line, so we also assumed that the straight line extended downwards to the left and upwards to the right. But you can see that at the upper end of the range here, the error is quite significant in our assumptions. And of course, you cannot go over 100% anyway. Now, you can get away with the straight line, but only if you are sure that you'll never want to go outside the range of x equals 10 to x equals 30. If you are likely to go outside that range, then you're going to be making errors. Now, I said that the S-curve has several applications in everyday life, and let me just share 3 of them with you. First of all, let's assume that a firm wants to introduce a new product. So what's going to happen? Like my YouTube channel here, you'd expect that demand in the first stage is going to be low as people are unaware of the product, and it takes time for people to find out about it and decide to buy it. Then over time, people become more aware of it and demand will increase. But at some point, demand is going to tail off. Perhaps there's a newer version on the market, a better version on the market, or that you've actually sold to everybody who wants this particular product. So that's example number 1. Example number 2 is private vehicle ownership, something I've dealt with a lot in my professional life as a transport consultant. As a general rule, and it's only a general rule, before GDP per capita in a country reaches around $5,000, vehicle ownership is pretty low. And then once you hit the $5,000 mark, vehicle ownership takes off. Now, of course, you get to a point where maximum vehicle ownership is 100%, but you never get to 100%. So again, as GDP increases, the curve will tail off and it will flatten and trend towards 100%, but never get there. A final example, which is quite close to my heart, because I've worked a lot on railway performance, are the percentage of trains arriving within 15 minutes of their booked time. Now, this might sound a bit esoteric, but it's a good example of the S-curve. What happens is when there aren't many trains around on the system, it's quite easy to get a high level of performance. But you can never actually reach 100%. And if you think about it, to actually attain the 100% becomes more and more difficult as you get towards 100%. So that is a good example of an S-curve. Let me show you a different sort of relationship, a fad. Now, I never owned one of these things. I have no idea what they do, but it struck me as a good example for this podcast. So this is a fidget spinner, which apparently was all the rage in 2017. Now, if you're going to get into the business of one of these, and Cabbage Patch Doll is another example, then you should realize it's got a limited shelf life. So what sort of relationship would you expect to see between sales and time? Well, I couldn't actually find sales data, but I was able to actually find Google search trends for the fidget spinner. And you can see that for a period of 6 months or so, demand, let's say, spiked. So it was a very short, sharp period of high demand. And I provided the link there for anyone who wants to read more about it. So if you want to actually forecast sales demand, here's an example of a curve which might fit the bill. And with this particular curve, you can see that it reaches a peak and then immediately goes down again. So it sort of fits the pattern for a fad. Now, you can see the function that I used to generate the chart on the right-hand side here. And you can alter these factors to make the curve peakier or flatter. So this is just an example. Another example of this sort of demand curve might be a specific brand of, let's say, mobile phone. So a company will introduce a new model and it will become very successful. But over time, it will get older, newer models will come in, which will make this current model less desirable, and then demand will tail off. So we might get a curve similar to this, but with a larger part in the middle where demand is flat, rather than just increasing, then immediately decreasing. Now, this is an example from my work, and this is train delays versus the number of train miles run. Now, what would we expect to happen here? You can imagine a motorway if you prefer cars to trains. When the motorway is pretty much empty at 3 in the morning, you expect very few delays. And then, of course, as the morning develops and we head towards rush hour, more and more cars come onto the motorway. And then, of course, as you hit rush hour itself, the peak of rush hour, you'll find that delays start piling up at a faster and faster rate. And you can see this not only on motorways or on railways, but you can see it in other places. For example, as a factory gets busier and busier, as it almost hits capacity, then the factory is going to get less efficient and productivity is going to decline. And a phenomenon has been in airport terminals or railway stations. You've seen this yourself, I'm sure. When a terminal gets too overloaded with people, then it gets really bad. And 2022 is a classic example of that, with overcrowded airport terminals and massive queues. I'm sure you all read about it. Hopefully none of you experienced it. It was quite horrendous. So in this particular curve, I have got an exponential function which reflects the fact that as the number of train miles run increases, the delays per train mile also increase. Now, I want to introduce this concept of relevant range because it is very important in forecasting. Now, I had a significantly larger sample than the client, and the range of my sample was from 450,000 train miles per railway period to a little over 1 million. The client's range was much smaller. In fact, the client's range, you can see, was about half mine. So what this is effectively saying is that the relationship would be valid within the range of your sample. But my range is much larger, therefore my analysis is valid over a significantly higher range of observations. Now, you can go a little bit outside the range of your sample, and I've just suggested there an absolute minimum and an absolute maximum, but they're not fixed in stone. The point is you can go, say, a little bit outside the range, but if you go too far outside the range, for example, if the client wished to test a value of, say, 1.1 million using his relationship, I'd say, well, hold on, your analysis does not come close to covering a data point over 1 million train miles per period, so you shouldn't really use it. That is very important. We come back once again to this issue about the fact that relationships and forecasting, as we will see, are based on samples, and the quality and quantity of your sample does feed into the quality of your forecasts. Here's an extreme example of relevant range and why you have to be careful. So this analyst has produced this pretty awful regression. You can see that the correlation is virtually zero. And you can see there's a linear relationship there, y equals 0.012, etc., etc. So as an extreme example, let's say you assume that rainfall was zero. Then that would actually suggest that the yield, would be 52.6. And that's clearly nonsense. If there's zero, absolutely zero rainfall, then yield is going to be effectively zero. So that's an example of the danger of using data points outside the relevant range. So what lessons can we draw from this little podcast? First of all, I hope I've demonstrated that there are plenty of relationships which aren't linear. So assuming they're linear from the outset could mean that you're heading for failure even before you've done a forecast. And try and consider what would be an appropriate curve or shape for the product or the company, whatever you're forecasting. And I tried to give some examples of that in this podcast. The second takeaway is ignore slope and intercept. Please never use it. The third point, as I've mentioned before, and I'll probably mention again, the Jewish mother in me, the quality of a relationship depends on the size of the sample and also the quality of the sample. I cannot stress that enough. And if you have a sample with a larger range, then the relationship you've established will be valid over a wider range of possible outcomes. And for forecasting, that is a very important issue. Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as I have enjoyed making it. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you and goodbye.